Hey guys, today I want to do a video on the crankshaft drive gear installation on a 2016 Duramax. Sorry about the background noise, I'm out here at the farm today. What I had happen was I had what they call a scissor gear that this rides on your camshaft, and I had a failure on this back gear. Of course it's upside down right now, but this back gear right here actually is spring loaded with this spring, and it fits on the back of the main drive gear for the camshaft, which was not damaged, but it fits behind it. It's hard to do one-handed. And see if I can get it to sit where it needs to be. Let me take the spring out here. This gear sits in behind and it's spring loaded, and what its purpose is to hold tension to mitigate the backlash so that these teeth stay meshed with the crank drive gear properly. Now this failure happened here, but the cam stayed in time because these teeth here are fine, but this one of course destroyed the crank drive gear, which I'll show you right quick. I got it on the back of this truck here. So as you can see, I got a lot of these old cranks that are broke that I was trying to figure a solution out on. It was on this crankshaft here. You can see it actually broke the bottom teeth off on the bottom of the gear set here, on the bottom of the gear. So what I run into was the mains were all perfectly fine. I had no damage to any of the main bearings. I had no damage to anything else. It looks as though, I don't know if you can look down in and see on the truck, looks as though the camshaft's fine. Now, however, the thrust plate for the camshaft is held on with these two bolts right here. It did suffer some damage on the outside of the plate. And but as far as the bearings go on the mains, I pulled some of the main bearings, checked them. I'm pretty sure the camshaft bearings are fine. There wasn't any damage here or anything to the crank or the camshaft itself, so I'm pretty sure that's fine. But I had to remove this gear right here. Of course, I've already got the new one installed, but this gear right here was the gear that had to come off, and everybody was saying, from what I researched, that you have to drop the crankshaft out of the vehicle to get this gear on. Well, to do that, I'd have to pull the motor pretty much. I mean, you could do it in the truck maybe, but it would be, the right way to do it would be to pull the motor for this one gear. Well, I decided against that because there wasn't any point that I saw, because there was no other damage that I could see. So I decided to come up with a way to install this gear with this crank still in the vehicle. So what I came up with, now first off before though, if you're watching this and you have your, where I put it over here, if you have your camshaft gear fail, or the bolt retaining bolt back out, and these teeth jump time, then the engine needs to come out, because the piston could come up and slap the valve, the head needs to come off, everything needs inspected, probably a new camshaft, the heads need reworked, pistons, whatever, there's damage somewhere internally. With a scissor gear failure like this, I didn't feel like there should have been damage to anything because these teeth never jump time. So what I ended up coming up with, I'll come over here and show you, because there's nothing on the internet that I came up with that showed me a way of doing it. First off, if you have the crank outside the vehicle, this would be the way I would pull it. Use a puller, a 10-ton puller, and you just crank it, and it'll actually pull the gear right off. This is the tool that I devised. I made this to install the gear in the vehicle. And what I did was use a taper bearing, sit it here, because if you don't have this bearing and you just try to put a well, I'm using this nut just for something to refer. Well, actually this is what actually presses, but as you can see, when you turn the nut, the bearing rotates but the cup stays solid. And that's critical, because if you don't have the bearing and you just have a flat surface here, the cup will rotate ever so slightly, and it will turn the gear on the shaft just enough. And this gear has to go on straight, or else it won't line up with your pins on your crankshaft. So that's the reason for the bearing being there. And these taper bearings can take quite a bit of a load. And then, of course, I have this one capped off and plugged because I was pulling the gear off of it. But the threads for your bolt here are an M18 by 1.5 thread pitch. So what I did was order me some piece of threaded rod that needs to be rated to handle the load. And I ordered a piece of it and threaded it all the way into the crankshaft. That's what actually sits in the middle. I've misplaced it. I don't know where I put it, but the rod goes through here, and then you tighten the nut. And as the nut tightens on the rod and the bearing will spin, it'll exert pressure onto the gear. Of course, this gear is upside down. It goes this way, but this is stepped right here. And so as you press it on, it'll press it straight down on, and it won't let the gear spin or rotate while you're trying to press. So it gives it a nice straight press onto the snout of the crank. Now, the reason I have this marked sharp edge is I experimented on these crankshafts to figure out what was the best way to press these on with it in the vehicle. I wrote sharp edge on this because if you look, of course this one came off the truck, so it's not as bad, but there's a lip right here, and that lip right there is razor sharp from the factory. Well, if you flip it around to press it on and it gets out of kilter, especially when you're first starting to press, if it's off one way or the other just the slightest bit, it will leave a bad gouge in the crank. Of course, I don't have the one. I think this is the one I damaged. Yeah, the first time I tried it, it left some scoring on the crankshaft. So that's why I redesigned this with the bearing. And that's why I haven't done it on this one, but I took a Dremel, and all you want to do is deburr that. Just take a little bit of the sharpness off of it so that it presses on. And if it gets off just a slight bit, it won't gouge into the crank. Another critical thing. So and you want to make sure these are cut at 90 degrees and everything's done really precise, because if it gets off kilter one way or the other, if it tips, if you got it cut crooked, it's going to put the wrong amount of pressure on one side versus the other, and it'll try to press it on crooked, and it'll also eat the crank up as it goes on. So you want it to just go on nice and smooth. Now, if I come back over here, I want to show you another step that I did is before you press it on, you want to mark. I don't know if you can see, but I've got this pin out. I'm replacing these pins. I already replaced the back pin. I had a new one, but I have to buy 2 more to go here. You want to change these pins out, even if they're not bad, just for insurance, because these are known to fail. But before I took the pins out, you want to lay a straight edge across the pins, all 3 pins. Take a paint pen and mark all the way down the snout of the crank. Put a corresponding mark on your gear. So that way when you press it on, you have a reference point here and here, so you can keep it lined up straight. And it don't want to twist, or if it twists or turn, you'll know. And if it turns off center just a little bit, it'll destroy the pins, and when you get it back here on the crank pin, it won't be lined up, and it'll destroy the crank pin. And it also keeps it clocked into time. You don't want this moving one way or the other, because it'll throw the timing off all the way up the chain, all the way up the injection pump, the cam, and the crank all have to be in time, which is another thing. But there's marks here. It's pretty straightforward, but there's marks that you line up, little dots. But anyways, so you want to make sure that stays straight. Then your tool comes over, you'll tighten the nut out here. Of course, I got a wrench on it now because I was using that to rotate the crank, but I was about to do my camshaft gear installation, and it's easier if you rock this. You can mesh the teeth easier and it slips on better. Of course, I got the thrust plate for the camshaft removed. I'm going to buy a new one and put on. It had some slight outside damage from where that scissor gear contacted it. But anyway, so that's the reason I have a wrench here. But that's another thing. Next step you want to do is put a line so you can press it on straight and they don't move. Now, I don't like to heat these. People will say heat the gear. It's an interference fit. If you measure the gear, the backside of the gear is 2 to 3 thousandths and 4 on some of them I measured. I've got several of these gears laying around. It's 2 to 4 thousandths bigger on the backside than the front. So when you start to press it on, it's actually, just ever so slightly tapered. So it gets tighter as it goes on. Now, if you heat it, first off, I feel like it might lose its integrity here. It might change the metal composition. It might weaken the teeth. It might, heat your crank snout up and cause damage to it. I don't like to heat it. So what I have this for other purposes, but it works great on this. You want to apply press fit lube. There it is, press fit lubrication. You want to apply this to the crank snout very liberally before you pull the crank or the cam gear, the crank gear, or you install it. And removing the old crank gear, everybody said it has to be pulled off, and you would use the puller like I had over there to pull it off, and then you would reinstall the new one on a press outside the truck. However, I'll go underneath so you can see what I'm talking about, but I'll crawl underneath this truck if I can, and we'll look at the way I removed it. So, give me a second here. If you look at the front, right here, if you look at the front, I've removed the front main cap, if you can see that. I don't know, my phone's not wanting to focus. But anyways, I removed the front crank cap, the front main cap, and it lets you access this gear from the back side here. You can put a puller on it, a 2-jaw puller, let it rest here and let it rest here, the jaws, and you can pull it out here. And you want to pull this, what I did was I pulled this this gear out until it was about right here. And then I finished pulling it with a 3-jaw puller. It came in and grabbed the back, and I pulled it the rest of the way out. So that's what I did here to get the old gear off. And I applied press fit lube here, and it slid off with no heat, and I installed it with no heat. So that's how I removed this gear, the old gear that was broke. Okay, so now that we've covered that, let me get back out from under this truck. All right. So, like I said, if you got your crankshaft outside the truck, again, this is how I would remove it. This is a 10-ton hydraulic puller, and if it is, sometimes these will get stuck, and you can apply some heat, and it'll pop on loose. A little heat's fine, but you don't want these things glowing cherry red. You don't want to overheat these. You don't want to overheat your crank snout. It'll cause damage. So, but that's how I ended up making the press tool and installing the crank gear on a 2016 Duramax. And this tool is homemade. I made this. So as far as I know, there may be something commercially available, but as far as I'm aware, there's not. But it seemed to work great for me. There was no gouging or scoring on the crankshaft when I was done. It press fitted it on perfectly. It stayed lined up. So if you guys are wanting to do this job, or if you have to do this job, if you have a similar failure, then this is a way to do it. But if you're planning on putting a keyway, which what a keyway does, you'll take these three holes, and this has to go to a machine shop. The crank has to come out. But what they do is they cut a keyway that travels all the way up to here. Of course, there's a step here, so there'll be a keyway and then a keyway, and it eliminates these pins, because these pins will fail. It's a common thing that happens. For my purposes, I'm leaving the pins because I don't want to pull the crank. I'm going to roll the dice, I guess, but I'm going to leave the pins. I put new pins, and I'm putting red Loctite on each pin when I install the new ones. I already did the back one. Got 2 ones on order on my truck over there. and I'm going to put red Loctite to help hold these pins in, and just pray they don't shear off. I've pulled several of these out, these cranks, and I've pulled several of the gears off, the oil pump drive gear and all that, where these pins have rather failed or they have been bent. And the camshaft is the same way. It's a little longer pin than these, but it is common for those things to fail. And I have pulled gears off where the pin is actually twisted around to the point where it's about to break off, but it hasn't broke. And I've seen them where they break completely off. Even if they look fine, I change them. But if you want to do the keyway, the crank has to come out. There's no way to do it without pulling the crank. And then, like I said, you can take it to the shop and they'll pull this gear for you, or they'll leave. These are press fit. They're not. These very, very seldomly will shear because there's such a tight interference fit here that these very seldom fail. So the only thing they probably will do, a lot of guys might insist on this, but they just put a keyway to the crank gear for the balancer and for your oil pump drive gear, and then of course they keyway the cam as well. But that's like I said, all the motor has to come out to do that. You got to pull all kinds of stuff to get your crank and cam out of the vehicle. And for my purposes, I'm leaving these in and just hoping they last. But anyway, so I hope I helped you guys. If anybody decides to do or has to do or decides to do a drive gear for the crankshaft on a Duramax diesel, that's the solution I came up with, and it worked great. The main thing is no burrs, use the good lubricant, and make sure your press tool is the right way. You don't want to, another thing I should mention, let me climb back up here, you don't want to use the threads in your crank. You don't, of course, I've got the factory bolt in there just to turn the crank just slightly to line the gears, but you don't want to use those threads inside the crank to pull that gear on, because if these threads inside of here, if you pull those, then the crankshaft will have to be rather taken to a shop to be machined out and rethreaded, or possibly change the whole crankshaft. I don't know how that would be fixed, but what I did was I used a threaded rod to go in the end all the way till it bottomed out, and it stuck out here, and I used the nut on the end to tighten to press it on, so there was no twisting or torsional load on the threads. It was a straight pull out, and it won't run the threads to put an outward load on it. But if you put a load on it out and turn it, you can pull the threads out of the crank, especially if your balancer bolt or the bolt you're using to press it with is only barely threaded in. You can pull all the threads out of the front of the crank. So make sure if you make an installer tool that you bottom out a piece of threaded rod. Mine was a 10.9, grade 10.9 threaded rod, a tool rod. So it was good solid threads, and it won't, if you thread all the way into the crank and put a straight load out, it will not pull out. So just make sure you do that. So, but anyway, as you can see, after installation, the crank has no damage. There's no gouging. There's no galling of the crank. It worked very well. So, but just make sure you're extra careful, and you can do it. So anyway, I hope I helped you guys. And do you have any questions, just leave them in the comments for me. All right. Thanks. Bye.